You're listening to the Sonny Brown Breakdown. Now, it is time to break it down.
Welcome to episode number 24 of the Sonny Brown Breakdown. I'm your host, Sonny Brown, and in this episode, I talk to Matt Thornton. Now, Matt is the founder of Straight Blast Gym International, or SBG as it's more commonly known, and is a 4th degree black belt under Chris Hauter. Now, he's one of the first Americans to get their black belt, and we discuss how training that in the 90s led him to emphasize the importance of training against resisting opponents in a concept he outlines further that he dubs aliveness, and also how cross-training in multiple arts taught him how each art uses their own delivery system to deliver techniques to students. And by training in those different styles, he could also identify the common themes between them of what works, and he can consider them fundamentals of all martial arts styles. And finally, we touch on in various ways how the real life testing in martial arts can kind of lead to a skepticism and the ability to think critically that can help you identify truths in martial arts and other areas of life. So I was really happy with how this interview went, really enjoyed it, thought it was a great conversation, so I hope you do too. Please, if you want to give me some feedback, you can send it through my emails, sonnybrown@gmail.com. Been talking a lot about feedback on these episodes, and it'd be great to hear what you guys have been enjoying and thinking of the podcasts. Also, there will be a transcript up of this episode eventually on sonnybrown.net. And also, I'm pretty active on the Instagram now, which is at Sonny Brown Breakdown on there. So, with all that said, hope you guys enjoy it. Now let's go to the podcast. Hi, Matt. How are you today?
Good. How are you?
Doing well, mate. Doing well.
Excellent.
So, you've been in the martial arts game for a long time. You've grown up as a traditional martial artist. You've now, started the Straight Blast Gym, which is well known now worldwide. But my understanding is that after, growing up in a traditional martial arts background, eventually you ran into Rickson Gracie and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu around the 90s. And then that really changed and informed your training practice and teaching methodology and led to the development of what you call aliveness.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you could start off just by explaining to people, how that happened, what exactly is aliveness, and how that's important.
Sure. So I had very little traditional martial arts training per se. I did a little bit of traditional karate when I was a kid. But I was always fascinated by martial arts and very quickly became super interested in the question about what works in fights and what doesn't work in fights. I got in fights in school, and so even as a boy, it was a question that interested me. And when I was in the military, straight out of high school, I was doing some research because I knew I wanted to do martial arts pretty much all my life. And I was looking for something that was functional. And I knew I wanted to do boxing, and I had kind of decided that boxing was the most functional thing to do as far as striking. But I'd also been in some fights where I've been taken down to the ground and put in headlocks and all this kind of stuff that happens when you get in fights as a kid. And I knew that you also had to have some grappling and some ground fighting. So this idea of being able to fight at all the different ranges made a lot of sense to me. And mind you, this is in the 80s before the UFC or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so through research, it looked to me at the time like Jeet Kune Do concepts, as it was being taught by people like Dan Inosanto and Paul Vunak, was kind of what that's what it was. That was what they said it was anyway. So when I got out of the Army, I started training in Jeet Kune Do concepts. I eventually became an instructor in that. I moved to Oregon and partnered up with another Jeet Kune Do instructor who was an instructor under Dan Inosanto. And I taught at a school there, while at the same time boxing at the local boxing gym here for, I think, the better part of 2 years. And in that time, I had a lot of exposure to the rest of the Jeet Kune Do community, the other instructors, and I started to become really disillusioned with it, which I've talked about before. We can go into that if you want, but a lot of hypocrisy, a lot of saying one thing and doing something else. And what I found to be a real inability to distinguish between things that work and things didn't work. So on one hand, they would make side-by-side comparisons with an art like Shotokan karate and talk about how boxing was a superior delivery system, which of course it is for striking. And on the other hand, I'd see these same people doing the most absurd Penjak Silat type stuff. Like if I was going to design something that would get you beat up in a fight, it couldn't even touch this. And I had trouble with that view. You know, it just wasn't congruent to me. And it was around that time when I started to question all that and think about aliveness and think about why some arts work and why some arts don't work, that I had my run-in with Gracie Jiu-Jitsu via Fabio Santos and Hickson. And when I went back to the school and explained to them what I had found, which to me was, you know, the missing link pretty much, and everything I'd always looked for, it was clear to me they weren't really interested and weren't interested in what I was interested in. So that's when I opened up my own school. And the question that consumed me when I was younger, and the one that I still got asked a lot, and I think was a far more common question before the UFC than it is now, but, you know, does this style work? Mm-hmm. You know, does Wing Chun work? Or does this particular style of karate work? And if so, why not? And my conclusion from doing the Jeet Kune Do concepts and the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and from those years in boxing was that what determined what works and what doesn't work is really the training method. And that the dead patterns, the traditional martial arts that had taken out aliveness, weren't going to help. And the combat sports, by definition, because they cared about results, had all kept aliveness. So the one thing that all the sports that actually work in a fight or in a self-defense situation had in common is they were all, the martial arts that work in that situation is that they were all sports. And what the sports had in common is that all sports train, combat sports train with aliveness. And so it's not about sparring. You can spar with anything. You can take the ridiculous martial art and spar with it, and over a long period of time, you're going to develop what looks like bad MMA. So it's not sparring. It is the actual training method itself, which always involves timing, energy, and motion. And absent that, then what you have is not going to translate. You're not going to have any timing, as Hickson would say. You may know the technique, but you don't have the timing. You won't be able to apply it. And timing only comes from an alive opponent. And it doesn't mean it has to be rough. It doesn't mean it doesn't even mean sparring. Because when we talk about drilling in SBG, we're always talking about aliveness. So all of our drills are alive. But it does have to be alive. It has to have that realistic energy, movement that's not in a contrived pattern, and timing that comes along with it. And when you have that, then you can train, as you know, I'm sure, an art like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you can train in a very soft way, for lack of a better term, if you're coming off an injury, a way that's not going to get you hurt, a way that's in no way rough, but actually still develop actual skill that'll translate against an opponent because you're training with aliveness. And so the thing I wanted to get across to people was not each art individually or making lists about what works and what doesn't work or talking about the need for sparring, but to actually talk about aliveness, because my position was anybody that really understood what I meant by aliveness would be impossible to be fooled again by bullshit martial arts. And if you don't understand aliveness, you could be a world champion. And I've seen this in action. World champion fighters and boxers and kickboxers who will be fooled by some hokey fake martial arts demonstration because they don't have that toolkit, which is really what aliveness is, to be able to distinguish between what works and what doesn't work. So that was what I felt was the most important thing about martial arts, assuming that you're looking for something that's true. And so that was the message that I ran with then and have been one way or another talking about for the last 25 years since.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And I'm wondering if you've ever run across this with, as you mentioned, with Jeet Kune Do. It's something I've found, ironically, that the famous Bruce Lee expression, take what's useful, reject what's not, add what's uniquely your own. I've found in some instances that people are now able to use that as actually a way of rejecting things that we know that definitely work, because they just say, hey, it works for me. And they can kind of say that with anything. Hey, it works for me. Don't judge. Is the difference that makes that saying applicable aliveness?
Yes. And so the difference is the understanding of aliveness, because somebody that understands aliveness isn't going to make that mistake. But that's also where it's helpful to talk about, you mentioned this when we started the podcast, and the reason why I started to refer to things as delivery systems. So if you look at Jeet Kune Do concepts, we'll use Jeet Kune Do, the Jeet Kune Do world as an example. After Bruce Lee's death, they kind of broke off into two main camps, right? And on one camp, they had guys who wanted to teach and fight exactly like Bruce Lee did. When he died when he was 33 in 1973 with limited exposure to things like Muay Thai and some of the other arts that we have now, but constantly growing and, in my opinion, from just looking at his notes, being motivated by many of the same things that interested me, which is research and truth in combat. But he was 33 years old, died in 1973, and weighed 130 some odd pounds, right? But they're trying to mimic this particular fighting style. That's one hand. The other hand, which was the Dan Inosanto Jeet Kune Do Concepts camp, ran with that saying, which Bruce Lee took from Mao Zedong, actually. Not a lot of people know, but, research your own experience, absorb what is useful, reject what is useless, add what is specifically your own, is the entirety of that saying, which is a utilitarian philosophy, and it makes sense. But that doesn't mean that you can just go to treat martial arts as an all-you-can-eat buffet where I'll take a Muay Thai kick and I'm going to blend it in with a Wing Chun punch and I'm going to take this and then I'm going to understand combat, because that's not how fighting works. How fighting works is we're human beings with two arms and two legs. There's only so many ways you can hold another human being down on the ground. Only so many ways you can escape. Only so many ways you can throw someone down efficiently. Only so many ways you can strike. Those ways are based on science. And so from an actual scientific perspective, what we want to look at is if we're talking about clinch, what the functional clinch arts all have in common. Judo, Mongolian wrestling, Sambo, Greco-Roman, freestyle, folk style. And once you start to understand what they all have in common, the core delivery system of clinch, then you really start to understand clinch. And then you're going to break it into the fundamentals that all great clinch wrestlers, athletes that train in clinch have and share in common. And you're going to learn those and pass those on. And then through sparring and training alive over years and years, and usually it takes at least 10 years, if not longer, you begin to develop your own style. And that style will be the setups that you like, the particular takedown you like. Because some guys might like a high single, and some guys are going to go for, a knee block, and somebody else becomes a master of ankle picks. And there's no better or worse in that hierarchy. But what all those guys have in common, if they're all truly capable of competing at an Olympic level, is just rock solid fundamentals. And so what Jeet Kune Do should have been looking for, or anybody that's really interested in taking a scientific approach should be looking for, is what are the fundamentals of stand-up, clinch, and ground? And then let's create an environment where we can learn those fundamentals safely, pass them on to the next generation, and then through a process of alive training in a way that's safe, each and every individual will have his own style. Just like every Jiu-Jitsu Black Belt has a very different style, every MMA fighter has a very different style. For most fighters to imitate, for example, how one of our fighters fights, like Conor McGregor, would be a mistake, because Conor has a very unique style. But the fundamentals that make Conor capable of doing what he does, those every fighter needs to have. Those fundamentals of stand-up, clinch, and ground. So if they come to SBG, they're not going to learn the Conor McGregor style, but they are going to learn the good fundamentals of stand-up, clinch, and ground. And then through a process of alive training, they will develop their own style. And to my way of thinking, that's what Jeet Kune Do actually is and should have been, and what I think Bruce Lee was shooting for, but not what happened. So I think that's actually what we do at SBG.
Okay, I understand that, and yeah, the idea of using those different styles, that even within those limitations, everyone's going to find their own way. And I've even thought myself, like, everyone is probably, romanticizes the idea of Jeet Kune Do, but if they were really following that philosophy, wouldn't they all be looking more like Valley Tudo MMA fighters these days?
They should have had a huge head start on everybody else if they had actually been following what they said they were doing, which was pursuing truth. in all the different ranges, they would have been light years ahead of everybody else when Horian started the challenge. They would have been the first true MMA fighters. There were some real pioneers that came out of that community. I don't want to overlook that by painting with too broad a brush, like Eric Paulson, for example. But Eric Paulson's great and was great because he's a great kickboxer, great wrestler, and a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I mean, he's working those same delivery systems, and that's what allowed him to fight at the level he could fight at. And but he was the exception to the rule when the vast majority of those students weren't really capable of defending themselves at those ranges because they hadn't been introduced to those functional delivery systems.
Yeah.
You can't really pick and choose, like, just to use a more concrete example as well, someone who's a white belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu isn't going to be capable of effectively applying that utilitarian philosophy from Mao Zedong about absorb what is useful and reject what is useless, because they have no idea yet what the fundamentals of grappling are. And when they become a black belt, they will. But even there, it's not a conscious thought process. I mean, most black belts don't think to themselves, I don't like that sweep. I'll do this sweep instead. You just develop that. Your body develops it through a live training, right? And then you find out as a brown belt or a black belt, hey, this is a sweep that really, speaks to me when I'm rolling, having a hard roll. These are the routes that I take. But it's not like they started out and looked through a book when they were a white belt and said, I'm going to use this sweep and I'll take this piece. I'll do Marcelo Garcia's arm drag and I'm going to blend it with Hodger's choke. This is just not how fighting works.
Yeah, no, definitely. There needs to be that, I think, that fundamental, that base layer of something that we're laying down for people as they come in. And I'm thinking as you're talking then, I'm just thinking about even going deeper than that technique with the idea of aliveness, because I just thought when I'm listening to debates between vegans, actually, which is where it's coming from, but I'm not looking to get into a conversation about let's save nutrition for another one, but I've heard debates and often one thing they say to, cause a common thing that will be thrown their way is why are you eating plants? There's some scientific studies they can find that plants react to pain or things like that. And the argument that they use is that they don't have a central nervous system, and they define it as, if something's alive, it has a central nervous system. If it doesn't have a central nervous system, then it's not alive, essentially. I think I might be not an expert on that. But my point is, do you think then that aliveness training could be people being aware of their own central nervous system and in some way training and activating their central nervous system deliberately that gives it that aliveness? That's what goes on with alive training. So what really made it click to me when I was a white belt was actually a video I saw of Rickson after I had first trained with him. And I don't even remember where, I'd gotten a bunch of VHS tapes of Rickson sparring and training from one of my friends, I think, that was a grappler. But anyway, one of them was he'd shown up at the Torrance Academy in swim trunks and just Iron Man wrestled one after the other everybody that's in the room. There's clips of it, pieces of it on YouTube now that have been watched many, many times. But at one time I had like a much lengthier version of it. It was like a 45-minute video of him rolling with everybody. And then at the end, he was sitting up against the wall like I am here, just relaxing. And a student was asking him why he thought he was so much better than everybody else. And he explained that jiu-jitsu is about timing, or jiu-jitsu is about knowledge of technique, yes, but it's also about timing. And then he talked about training a triangle, and he said, you start with the triangle tight and close to take away space, and then you make sure that there's some failure and some success, and as the success outweighs the failure, you open up the space more, and you slowly begin, and he's basically talking about adaptive resistance. And the moment he said that, and he was telling this person that was his key for how he got good. And the moment he said that, I realized instantly that's exactly what's missing in all these other martial arts. They don't have that sense of aliveness. That's not sparring. I mean, it is, but it's just a very small window of what happens. But Rickson did that with everything. And so what most jiu-jitsu instructors call positional sparring, for us in SBG, that's what we call drilling. But you can take that principle and you can apply it to boxing. You can apply it to self-defense against a blade. You can apply it to anything. I have
SBG instructors who apply it to firearms training. And you can take the steps and break them down as far as introduction, isolation, and integration back into the game. And we've we took that little kernel of truth that Rickson was offering there, and it blossomed into a whole series of training methods, epistemology that we use here at SBG, and we've been using since to train. But most combat sports have some version or another of this. Wrestlers train this way, boxers train this way, Muay Thai fighters train this way. There's always that sense of timing, that sense of aliveness you're getting. Even good Thai boxers, when they're working the pads, they're still getting timing from the person that's feeding them the Thai pads. And that's what makes those guys who are really good at Thai pads, what makes them so valuable and what makes them so good to fighters is that very thing. The fact that they can replicate that level of timing that fighter might receive in the ring, so that he's actually learning. But if you take away that aliveness, that timing, and you just do repetitions, like, for example, imagine a stuffed dummy, and you just do 100 repetitions of an arm bar from closed guard bottom on a stuffed dummy. You're practicing the movement, but there's no timing. There's no resistance. You could do that for 10 years. Your arm bar is still going to suck. Or you can take 5 minutes and grab someone, put them in that position, let them struggle with you until you finish, and then make it a little looser the way Rickson said. And in an hour, you can dramatically increase your ability to apply an arm lock. And that's the difference between alive training and dead pattern training. And the traditional martial arts, by definition, are really just a series of dead patterns. There are things that you memorize, and the other person performs an action, like usually they step forward with some kind of punch, then they freeze, and then the other person does all their cool shit, which is rehearsed. But that has nothing to do with somebody who's going to be moving around trying to punch you in the face. And that disconnect, understanding why that disconnect occurs is what aliveness is all about.
Yeah, okay. So it's really being able to get that timing down of working with another live opponent, or live partner. Right. So I guess when I was first thinking it's about your own central nervous system, it's actually really going to be then about the interplay between the two people. You can't have one person who's, aliveness and the other person who's not on board, right? It's got to be that communication between the two.
Yes, exactly. Because that's what you're getting feedback from.
Yeah, okay.
Let me use a different example, which is one I've used before, but tennis, right? So if I wanted to teach somebody how to work on a backhand, I'm a terrible tennis player, but let's just say, for example, I was a tennis coach, and somebody said, hey, I need to work on my backhand. I could make up a tennis kata, and we could put them in the garage, and they could do an hour of tennis kata every day for a decade. And I could criticize them as they go. Your thumb is too far, your left pinky needs to be out more this way, your right shoulder's too back behind your left shoulder, and we could get really nuanced with it. And you can imagine what's going on. Nothing from that, I think, is going to develop good tennis skills. Or you can take someone, have them throw a backhand a couple times in the air. We do have to do that. We call that the introduction stage, just to make sure they have the rote mechanics of it, which usually takes, if the person's just an average human being and it's not something that's too complicated, it usually takes 5 to 10 minutes. And then after that, what am I going to do? I'm going to stick them on a court and I'm going to lob balls at them. And I'm not going to try and hit them as hard as I can, as fast as I can, so they can't hit the ball back. I'm going to hit it slow. And then as they start to hit the ball, and they're going to miss sometimes because failure is an essential part of live training. And then as they start to get better at hitting the ball back with a backhand, I put in more energy and fake them out more. It's just more resistance. But there's no aliveness until that ball comes in, right? Aliveness now is me, or whatever's shooting the ball, could be a machine, moving a moving target that's different every time that they have to respond to. So the nervous system has to respond to that. And through that process, they can develop a good backhand. But imagine teaching tennis the way we teach traditional martial arts.
Yeah, no one would do it, right? It's just, it wouldn't work. And I mean, it makes a lot of sense. I guess in tennis, it's easy to hit the ball at someone. That's what they're expecting. With, let's say jiu-jitsu, when, guys come in, they start drilling, a common thing would probably be, they're either, completely not giving any aliveness when they start off, or they're at the opposite spectrum and they're too alive and flailing around. And I've always thought it's a very crude method, but often used is we go, hey guys, go 50% today. 50%
Sure.
while we're drilling. And it's, like I said, I feel it's a crude method, but it kind of can get the point across to somewhere, find that middle. What do you think? Is there a better way to actually teach people how to train with proper aliveness?
I think you have to explain, first of all, I think you have to explain the process to people. So we explain to them, at my gym anyway, we'll explain to them what aliveness is, why we're doing this, the importance of drilling that way, so they understand what they're achieving, and also so they have expectations going into it that they should be failing some of the time. If they're not failing some of the time, they're not learning at the level that they could be learning at, so that they don't go in there thinking it's supposed to work every single time, and they've somehow messed up. And so once we set those expectations, then, you can talk to them the way you did and try and explain percentages of, but the problem is, I'm sure you realize, is 50% is completely different to different people. Exactly. So one of the best ways to do it is, if you have an experienced coach on the mat or teacher, is to pick partners for everybody, which we often do. And if there's somebody who really has trouble relaxing and being able to, tone it down sometimes, maybe we might have them go with a more advanced practitioner who's going to be able to handle that kind of pressure without worrying about getting hurt. So you have to adjust it. But you're absolutely correct. The key to the whole thing is adaptive resistance. So, people sometimes think, well, that just means you're just throwing people right into sparring, which is not what we do at all. We're throwing them right away into timing, but it's adaptive resistance. And we changed from using the word progressive to adaptive, because the word progressive assumes in a way that we're always turning it up, when sometimes we turn it back down. And you, as the training partner, can adjust that with your training partner however you feel like you need to. And in the beginning, the coach will do it for the students until they kind of learn how to do it. And for sure, there's going to be people who are much better training partners, and other people that maybe you don't want as a training partner because they struggle to use adaptive resistance. And sometimes that's okay too, because sometimes you can just match people up by weight and belt level, and they're just really good match for each other. So if both people go 100%, it still works out fine. Mm. But the coach and the students have to figure out how to make it work. But one way or another, it has to be alive. Otherwise, again, we're just back to dead repetitions. And unfortunately, even with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, that's often how it's taught. They'll show technique, and then you roll. And the saving grace for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is the fact that they roll. And unlike striking, you can roll every day and not get brain damage, so people can roll a lot. But that middle piece of drilling the technique that you just learned in class with timing is often non-existent in many Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu schools. And so what happens is a lot of people get weeded out, and a lot of people have a longer learning curve than is necessary. And then other people who are more, for lack of a better term, natural athletes, or just tough to begin with, can just survive that process, and through the rolling will develop skill. You'll still get good. But I think Rickson's way is smarter and certainly faster.
Yep. I definitely agree with you on that. And yeah, the idea of people having different percentage levels is always one that's thrown me off, because sometimes, we'll be like, hey, we're drilling 50%. And then I'll say, put it up to 80. And as the words come out of my mouth, right, I'm like, this is, how am I going to know what everyone's different 80% is? But I like the idea of that's where, paying attention as a coach and making sure people are matched up is correct. And the other way I've started thinking about a good way to do that is then turning that drilling time into different types of games that people can play. Because when people are kids, everyone's playing, everyone has the understanding of what a game is. And if someone's taking it too seriously, it ruins the game, right? And I'm thinking, is there any way that you've used games in your coaching, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. So, you're 100% right. That sets the right tone, I think. With rare exception, is it helpful to have the tension too high? It should be a playful environment. It has to be an environment where the athletes and the students feel safe being vulnerable. That's essential. So if people don't feel safe being vulnerable, they're not going to take risks. They're not going to want to risk getting arm locked, or risk getting someone on their back, or risk getting into a particular position because they're afraid they're going to get hurt. And so it's really, really important that that environment is an environment where everybody, not just the top people or the upper belts or the athletes, but everyone feels safe. And then they go into the drill with the expectation of failing a good percentage of the time and having fun. And once those, and to be honest with you, it doesn't take people long to adapt. Alive training is fun. My experience has been anybody that's done a lot of alive training just can't go back, even if they wanted to, because you can't teach it in a non-alive way because it doesn't feel honest. And it's boring, where you know that there's a better way you can do it. Alive training, what it always does almost instantly is it engages you in an activity where you're required to be present.
Yeah.
You can't sit around and daydream in your head. You can repeat a pattern and be thinking about whether or not you left the stove on. But when you have to actually respond real time to someone else, then the people get absorbed by that activity, and people love that too. That's part of what gets people hooked to jiu-jitsu. So 100%, I think treating the drills as a game is absolutely healthy.
Yeah, okay. I like that. And while you were talking about, getting to dead patterns, I just thought that, is that something where in actual fighting where you might try and put your opponent into a dead pattern or make them follow a pattern while you're still alive to get an advantage over them? Is that something you can do? Like getting people into a rhythm and then you're breaking the rhythm. Sure. Is that something that could be played with?
It's not a dead pattern by definition means it's rehearsed and the same every time. So it's something that you've memorized and just repeat over and over and over again. And maybe every once in a while you'll put in something like, did you ever train Jeet Kune Do or Kali?
No, I've done a few classes of Eskrima. Yeah. Arnis.
So usually in those Filipino martial arts, they'll have stick patterns you do. Right, so you'll click the sticks together in a particular pattern with variations of forehands and backhands, and then sometimes you'll do things like they call sombrada, where you're feeding an angle and going back and forth. But it is a pattern, right? Mm-hmm. I'm responding in a particular pattern. You're responding in a particular pattern. Every once in a while, somebody might break the pattern and put in what they call a broken rhythm, but it's still a pattern. That doesn't really relate to anything that happens when you put a stick in somebody's hand and they actually want to hit you in the head. So that's going to be a dead pattern. What you're describing is knowing in advance what someone's going to do and being able to set up, for lack of a better word, an ambush for them, which we do often in jiu-jitsu. So you'll put somebody in a position where you kind of know where they're going to escape, and their escape is your finish. Like, for example, in the early UFCs, or the go-to for self-defense is you get in a fight with somebody that's not also a trained fighter. You take them down, you mount them, you slap them in the face, you know they're going to roll belly down, and you finish them with a choke. That's not really a dead pattern, but that is you knowing what's going to happen because you've been there so many times with resisting opponents, alive opponents, and this other person hasn't. And you can predict with good accuracy where this is going to go, and you can be there before they can with your body and with your movement because you have that timing. And that really becomes even more apparent when the skill level, there's a huge disparity in skill level where, what belt are you in jiu-jitsu?
Black belt.
Black belt, okay. So as a black belt, you could be rolling with, well, here, let me run this by you. Have you experienced rolling with a brand new white belt who's super athletic, maybe not necessarily a wrestler, but let's say played rugby or something like that, and they're a pain in the ass because they're going everywhere and you don't really know what they're doing. And then when they first get their blue belt, they're much better, obviously, at jiu-jitsu, but they're a little bit easier for you to deal with because you can kind of now predict what they're going to do, and it's not so spastic, right? And so that really what separates you as a black belt from them as a blue belt or a purple belt is it's not always knowledge of technique. Very often they may know more technique. It's that timing. And if your timing is good enough, they can know exactly what you're going to do. You could tell them, I am going to take your left arm from cross sides or whatever, and do it. And that is an example, I think, of how powerful alive training is because you develop this level of timing, and timing really is the ultimate superpower in fighting. Everything is predicated on timing and managing distance. And if you manage distance and control the timing, you're going to control that event. You're going to control the outcome.
Okay. Yeah, I understand that. And I know exactly what you're talking about of when someone comes in off the street and, they'll do something that you're not expecting and throws you off. And I'm lucky my coach, Anthony Lang's always said, when people do come in for the first time, make sure you roll with them, because that's going to giving you a realistic look of what it's going to be like if you did get into a fight with someone at the bus stop. He would say, that's
Yeah, no, that's great advice. That's so true.
Yeah.
We forget that because after a while we start doing jiu-jitsu versus jiu-jitsu, and we forget what jiu-jitsu versus the world feels like. It's good to go back and revisit that sometimes.
Yeah. It's so important because, you might not run into a blue belt at the bus stop, but, so with those patterns then, and in traditional martial arts, how do you think they lost that element of aliveness? Did they have that spark at one point and it just faded out over time? And, how did that happen?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Short answer, I don't know.
Sure.
Long answer is I suspect that there's a couple different reasons and that different ways this occurs. So the first way is they never had it to begin with. And I actually think that is the most common way. So there's a lot of, when you start to look at some of these martial arts, for example, if you take a look at Wing Chun, just to pick one, but we could pick anything. You really can't trace the history of that art past one or two guys before Yip Man, right? So Bruce instructor. Once you go any further past that, it really becomes hazy and you don't know where it came from. And there have been scholars that have posited that it's actually just comes from British boxing or the European boxing. And you can kind of see so much of the similarities in the old style boxing. And people in Hong Kong, being a port of so much great trade, would have had lots of exposure to this kind of thing. And they could have taken something like that and then ruined it by making it even more of a set of dead patterns. And that could have been where it came from. Other situations where I know for a fact it was just from the very beginning a con game, So I think of this also in terms of religion, because I see 100% parallels between traditional martial arts and religion, both in the epistemology as well as the rationalizations and excuses for them. And if you think about it in religion, was there ever a kernel of truth to a particular religion? Oftentimes there is, right? And then in other cases, we know, you're not Mormon, are you?
No.
Okay. Just thought I'd ask ahead of time.
No, that's fine.
Okay. I think for anybody that's not Mormon and hasn't been indoctrinated that way, with a little bit of study, it becomes pretty clear that Joseph Smith was a con artist. That he set out intentionally to create a religion, both to make a bunch of money and to have sex with a lot of young girls. That was his thing. That's what he did. And it's even more clear, I think, with Scientology. L. Ron Hubbard. You go on YouTube and watch that guy, and he's a sociopath who said himself he wanted to create a religion so he could get rich and have sex with lots of girls and not pay taxes. That was his whole idea, to get tax-exempt status, which he achieved, by the way. So sometimes I think it's from the get-go. There have been, for example, systems of silat that I've seen where I think they just made it up. They see some people, or Filipino martial arts, they see some people who are a little bit credulous, maybe a little bit naive. They create a pattern, or they take other patterns they've seen before, and then they'll say they're a grandmaster or whatever, and now you have a system and you have a way to make money. So that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect of it is sometimes I think it may have been functional and then it loses its function because sporting aspects are no longer there. And I think Japanese jiu-jitsu is a great example of that. We know Japanese jiu-jitsu at one point was 100% functional battlefield art that was designed for samurai and people who were fighting in Japan on the battlefield. When they lose their weapon, you get the guy in the back and stab him in the head before he stabs you and kill him. That's the art. Mm-hmm. And then as that part of fighting, that kind of fighting phases down through peacetime or because of the evolution of firearms and warfare, whatever it is, it no longer becomes necessary to train in a functional way. And then sometimes it gets systematized and people put it into a series of patterns in some way to try and preserve it. And the only way it's saved as a functional art is if somebody turns it into a sport. Like And then it'll evolve according to the rules. And so because they put so much of an emphasis on throws as opposed to the ground fighting in judo, they really evolved the upper body throws, but their ground fighting is not on par with what happened in Brazil, where the rules were, we're going to fight, and then it's a macho culture, nobody else is going to interrupt, and we're not going to break it up, and nobody's going to stand up, and you can basically do whatever you want. And in that petri dish of South America, they took what was really old judo and evolved the ground fighting game, because if somebody doesn't come in and break up a fight, it stays on the ground, right? Usually for a long time.
Yep.
So depending on what happens culturally, you can have an art go. And then now you have Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, which most places around the world, in the United States and Europe that I've gone to, is a Japanese Jiu-Jitsu Black Belt who's had no exposure to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Judo, is completely incapable of defending himself against a blue belt. And we all kind of know that. They have all the same locks and the names for them and everything, but if you just touch hands and wrestle to submission, your typical blue belt with 2 years of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is going to wipe the floor with a 4th degree black belt in Japanese Jiu-Jitsu because of aliveness.
Mm.
So in long story short, I think it depends. Sometimes they're created as cons, just like religions, and sometimes the function, the society evolves in a way where the function is no longer necessarily there. And unless it's turned into a sport where there's people still care about the results, it seems pretty natural for things to devolve into dead patterns.
Yeah. Okay. I think I get what you're saying, and I should say I'm not a Mormon, but I have been a bit sympathetic to them recently due to their ability to take the joke of the Book of Mormon so well. Apparently, I'm like, okay, they're not so bad.
The disclaimer, real quick: growing up in California, and here on the West Coast of the United States, I've had plenty of opportunity to interact with Mormons, and they're always very nice people. And if I was going to pick a city to live in and somebody told me, well, it's like 80% Mormon in that city, that'd be fine with me. It's a great place to raise your family. But I do think Joseph Smith was a con artist. So we can separate the fact that these are really nice people from that, I think.
I'm with you on that. And so it seems like, that as long as something gets turned into a sport, then it will get that feedback element of aliveness just by definition.
That's it. And what you said there, feedback element, is the key to it. And that's the opponent process.
Yeah. Okay. And then and I guess like with Scientology, for example, it didn't get that feedback because there's no means for it to. And what L. Ron Hubbard wrote down is just dogma that will never change. And funny example I can think of that is apparently in their Sea Org organization, to wash the windows, they're only allowed to use, I think, vinegar and lemon or something still, I heard, because at the time that was the best thing available, and that was what he wrote down to use. So they don't use Windex or anything like that. And that's a whole nother topic. But that inability to update, I guess.
Yes. And what's interesting in relation to exactly what you're saying is those arts, especially the ones that I think were designed to be that way, even if they weren't designed to be that way, I think it happens anyway, where the arts that have stuck around for a really long time, that are dead patterns. And here's another fallacy I run into all the time, because the way you didn't ask it this way, but the way a lot of people will ask it is, if those martial arts are all bullshit, like you say, why have they been around for so long? And the unwritten assumption, unthought assumption in that premise is, because something's been around for a long time, it therefore must be useful, which we both know is a fallacy. Things that are around a long time are around a long time. The only thing that tells us is they're good at replication. Astrology's been around for thousands of years. It's not useful. It's good at replication. So when you talk about these dead patterns, these dead traditions, or something like Scientology, they actually develop through a process of evolution that doesn't require conscious thought, or sometimes by a clever con artist like L. Ron Hubbard. They develop defense mechanisms that prevent feedback loops and opponent processes and prevent the whole scam from being revealed. And the more feedback mechanisms they have to protect their dogma, to protect it from science, to protect it from questioning or test, the longer they survive in many ways, right? that's part of what happens. And you can look at it and say, well, this has been around a long time, precisely because you're not allowed to question it. There's all kinds of traditions they have that protect their weird ideas. And you can see the same thing with make-believe martial arts.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. You mentioned that they're good at replication because, yeah, I'd love to think that the idea that something's been around, it's true or it's good, or even if something's popular, it must be great. But if a lot of people watching it, but we know that that's not always the case, or it could be a matter of taste. But with the replication thing, then I'm wondering if it's a personality part of human nature, then, because I kind of get the feeling that people who would be more resistant to change and more reluctant to open up to new ideas would probably be actually also better at replicating that same idea as well. That mindset seems to go hand in hand. No, this is good. We're just going to keep doing it over and over again, and we're going to get real good at doing the same thing. Do you think there's something to it, that personality aspect?
Oh, for sure. I definitely think there's something to that. I also think that the real piece, to me, the thing that it really comes down to is what motivates the people who are following or choosing to believe in those systems. So in my case, for whatever weird reasons, I was motivated to understand what works and what doesn't work in fighting. And as a young man in my early 30s, that meant I cared a lot about who I could beat, not beat, and being able to be good. And that eventually gave way to being a teacher and taking pride in my work in other ways. But the fact that I was motivated by what actually works, that's what kept me asking questions and created the volition to, do Aliveness. And I would have, one way or another, I would have gravitated to something functional. I've seen other people that that's not interesting to them. If their main goal in martial arts isn't that it works, or that it's functional, or to be able to defend themselves, or that it has to be true, but more the social aspect of it, or they just like clicking sticks together, or maybe they like to collect patterns. There are people that like to collect things like stamps and things like that.
Yeah.
If that's what motivates them. They're not really going to be moved by you and I talking about Aliveness because that's not their main interest. But I do think that there are also people who are motivated by the same things that drew me to martial arts, and maybe the same things that drew you to martial arts. And for a while, wind up getting fooled and or wasting time. Well, I know there are people like that because I get thousands of emails from them over the years because they are grateful. And when that happens, when they all of a sudden realize, like, for example, my friend Rokas, who probably edits a lot of our videos, was an Aikido instructor who on his own said, I'm going to try it out against MMA and see if Aikido works. And when the obvious happened, he had a choice. Do I now pretend that didn't happen, or do I let Aikido go and take a path on towards functional martial arts? He thankfully took the path towards what's true, but what if he wasn't motivated by what's true, right? Mm-hmm. Would have gone back and started and decided to stay in Aikido. But that's proof positive that there are people in those systems who just don't know. Just like there's people that get sucked into Scientology or Mormonism or whatever. They've never really heard the arguments for evolution or critical thinking applied to religious dogma. I hadn't. I grew up in a fairly conservative religious family, and it wasn't until I read on my own that I learned anything about evolution. It's not like you learn a lot about that in American high school or secondary school. So anyway, I'm going on a tangent, but I think the conversation's worthwhile to have.
Yeah, no, I think so too. Just as a quick side, is that the person who's doing Aikido? Is he on YouTube as Martial Arts Journey, I think?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I've watched, when he first uploaded, I followed his, his dealings with Aikido and going into Jiu-Jitsu, and it was interesting, and he did take a good perspective on things. With that perspective, I was just thinking, as you said, you're motivated by what's good or, being good. And, and for us, that's being good against alive resisting opponents. And I was thinking, for the people that have fallen into that, repetitive, style of patterns, it's probably their perspective is they are following what's good, but they've got good at those repetitive patterns. That's their concept of good. They're the best at repeating those repetitive patterns without a doubt. And I guess, in society, there's some people where, not some, there's definitely a need for that, right? People who can just go out to work and, hey, there's the same thing over and over again. But then we also need the people who are going to bring in the new stuff and the new ideas as well, right? Would you think that that's roughly?
For sure. I don't have any problem with someone. I mean, people, of course, I want to live in a society where people are free to do whatever kind of martial art they want.
Yeah.
So we'll take that off the table, of course. And I don't have any problem with someone who really wants to train and learn Aikido. What I have a problem with is when they start teaching Aikido, and they think that it's going to help people defend themselves in what could be a life or death situation. And what happens so often is you'll have Aikido instructors, using Aikido as an example, but it could be any fake martial art, who will run into someone like me or you, who they know has a background or is a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. They'll say one thing to us. Well, I train it for cultural reasons. Aikido is about spiritual development and mastering the inner self. We're not really talking about fighting people. So, we're just on a different journey, and it all sounds really good. But then if you were to drop in and have a hidden camera and microphone in their Aikido class when you're not around, that's not what they're offering.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's healthy for people. I don't think it would have, and let's use another example. We talk about Rokas. I don't think it would have been healthy for Rokas to continue doing Aikido after he made his discovery, because he's smart enough to realize it didn't work. And so what are you left with then after that? You're left with trying to rationalize and defend a position that's pretty indefensible and then teach it to other people.
Mm-hmm.
The whole thing is really dishonest in a way.
Yep.
Now, if he said, yeah, it doesn't work, I've discovered it doesn't work, if you want to learn how to fight, go do MMA, go do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I'm going to teach for, and he has some other reason there, that's fine. I just rarely see that happen.
Yeah, I hear you. I think that idea of it being dishonest is a big one, because I think from what you're saying, it's like if people want to say, hey, I do this art and I'm really good at repeating these patterns, I'm really, really good at it. So I'm sure, yeah, you are good at repeating those patterns, no doubt. And if they want to say, this is a beautiful art, has so many elements of beauty, and look at how I'm, moving, and it's a beautiful thing I'm doing. It's like, yeah, that can be beautiful. It's beautiful. But I think the distinction is if they say, this is a good combat martial art, and you have to go, hey, that's not true. That's not the truth.
Right. And on top of that, in a way, I'm still giving them too much credit, because anything somebody would say about Aikido as far as benefits, and usually they'll chime in on things related to self-actualization or development of people's personalities, I believe is you found in much larger quantities in an alive martial art like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Like the things that have benefited me in terms of maturing as a human being and using my job, my art to be a better human being, those lessons through martial arts came about as a direct result of the pressure of alive training.
Mm.
Right? It wasn't because I got a belt or learned a certain volume of techniques or read Asian philosophy. It's the trials and journeys of having to tap thousands of times for 15, 20 years, and all that comes along with aging and passing on the information and dealing with your own ego when someone younger comes in and you still roll, and then you roll and the whole thing. And to avoid that process, to take yourself out of that process, out of rolling, out of the alive training, I think is bad for human beings. Everything that's been valuable, the most valuable to me about the art, personally, is a direct result of the fact that it's alive.
I'm with you there, really 100%. I'm probably giving them the benefit of the doubt, that other perspective, but like in reality, there's probably not a lot of people who do take that perspective, like, oh no, this is no good for self-defense. It's just, I'm just moving around in a beautiful, beautiful art form. That's probably not as common. Right. And you do have to look at, if you're in a group that would allow a lot of dishonesty, because probably the majority of people would say that what they're doing is good combat. And if you're in a group that's everyone's not telling the truth, then how are you going to get those insights? How are you going to get those insights? It can't be good.
You wind up like Steven Seagal. You want that? He's another
kettle of fish. Oh dear. And so we've got that. Do you think then, like with your talk on those delivery systems, all the delivery systems then that you're relating to, are they those alive martial arts, or is there anything you go, hey, we do a little bit of take something from a Wing Chun, and do you ever take anything from that, or is the aliveness it's from those martial arts that have always had that in that?
Speaking for my curriculum, I mean, SBG is a big organization, and there is some variety in the different coaches. So speaking for myself at my gym here, our ground fighting is all Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. There's some wrestling mixed in there, but again, there's some wrestling mixed into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because of the influence of Bob Anderson and Holmes Gracie, and how that influenced Jiu-Jitsu. And then the clinch is derived primarily from Greco, but also there's some Muay Thai and there's some folk style and freestyle. If I learn anything awesome from another wrestler about clinch, we immediately, put it into the curriculum. And the stand-up is a variation of boxing. For me, it's more boxing. For some of the other gyms, they might be more Muay Thai-based. But to me, whether we're talking about boxing or Muay Thai or boxe française, savate, it's essentially the same delivery system. And, if you're really good at any functional martial art, it's pretty easy to go back and forth between the other arts of the same range. So judo black belt, in my experience, is going to have a bit of an edge on somebody that's not a judo black belt when they do Greco. And I had the privilege in the past to work with a lot of really good Olympic level Greco-Roman guys. And there was some things they had to get used to with the grip and things like that. But man, they were still animals in the clinch because, the fundamentals that define a good, for example, hip toss are the same in Mongolia as they are in judo, as they are in folk style. And so it's real easy to go back and forth, but you can't do that with a traditional martial art because it's just not the same delivery system.
Yep.
And like I said earlier, we should be looking for is what they have in common. And ultimately what should happen, one of the other coaches, a lot of the other coaches in the gym, for example, one of the things they'll say is, it's just wrestling. It's all wrestling. Right? And I say Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu to give credit to my coaches because that's where I learned it from. And there's that level of integrity to say I've learned this from, and we pass that on. But from a scientific perspective, saying Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Japanese Jiu-Jitsu should, and ultimately I think will, sound a lot like saying Canadian geometry or Japanese.
I get you.
And that's where we should be going, to the point where we're just talking about wrestling or Jiu-Jitsu, whatever word you want to use. But it's scientific fighting on the ground.
Okay. I really like that and agree with you. And so it seems like your motivation or your search in martial arts is then finding essentially the truth between all those different combat sports, Muay Thai clinch, sumo wrestling clinch, Greco, judo, whatever works between all those is going to be the truth.
The fundamentals.
The fundamentals, okay?
The fundamentals of that delivery system. The things that everybody needs to know how to do, that everybody's going to do more or less the same way, that define your ability to be able to play the game. Right? And that's all based on human movement, as Connor would say. It's all essentially basic human movement. It's the same now as it's always been, because we only have 2 arms and 2 legs. So in many ways, we're rediscovering it. And I'm sure if we were to go back in time, I suspect when the Greeks fought pankration, we'd see something that looks very similar to what we're doing now, because they had hundreds of years to, work on it. But yeah, no, that's ultimately what our goal is. And then the SBG way is to really limit yourself in class. And I try and do this when I teach the actual curriculum and what we teach in class to only the fundamental movements. And then what that does is that actually creates more room for freedom of expression than you would otherwise have. And a lot of people, I think, get this part wrong too, because the more you get into the weeds about, for example, your particular sweep, you obviously you're going to have routes you're very good at as a black belt. And if you pass that on, I go here and then they do this, and then I go here and then they do this, and you have this long chain of movements, it may or may not relate to 90% of the people in that room, ever. I've never seen another black belt Marcelo Garcia's taught that has his game. But if you focus just on fundamentals and then let the students play in an environment like you create in a live game, like you were talking about before, ultimately what you're going to get is a room full of black belts who all look completely different, which is how I believe jiu-jitsu and fighting should be. That goes back to kind of the judo part of it. But you really, as a coach and a teacher, you stifle that process when you go beyond the fundamentals, because then you're actually kind of giving them a style, which I think is a mistake.
Yeah, okay, that's a big, that's a really big concept for me to get, I think, but it makes a lot of sense that you just focus on the truth. You're just teaching students the truth of all martial arts that works across all styles, which you call, those are the fundamentals. And then from that foundation, their own form of expression is going to grow out of it, and that they're going to end up looking different. But because they have the truth as their basis, it's all going to be good. It's all going to be efficient, effective martial arts. Is that?
Exactly. And it also means that, conversations like gi or no gi, MMA, self-defense don't really matter that much, because the fundamentals are the fundamentals. There's no special mount escape I do if I'm caught in the 7-Eleven parking lot that's going to be different from what I'm doing in jiu-jitsu at the gym, right? It's the same fundamental human movement. So when you have a school that focuses on fundamentals like we try and do at SBG, you'll have some athletes that want to compete IBJJF, and they can go do that, and they can compete, and they can do well. You'll have some that want to fight, a few that want to get in the cage, and they can do that, and they'll do well. Some that want to prefer not wearing the gi, some that prefer wearing the gi. And, it doesn't really matter, because if you really are good at fundamentals, you should be able to play. You'll be better at some than others, but you should be able to play in all those different theaters of operation and do well. And if your game falls apart when you put the gi on or take the gi off, or somebody's allowed to punch you in the face, by definition, you don't have good fundamentals.
Yeah, okay. That's huge. And then would it be, a lot of people might even have misconceptions then of what your idea of fundamentals are, because it's really that, it's fundamental movements that.
Yes. I get asked a lot, like, what is a fundamental? Right. And my basic answer to people is I can list specific techniques, specific human movements, but the real answer is it's going to transcend venue, it's going to transcend uniform, it's going to transcend bodies, it's going to transcend era, and it's going to transcend geography. So just like I said, there's no such thing as Canadian geometry. Take a rear naked choke as an example. An efficient rear naked choke. You also have to define our goal. Our goal isn't just working in a fight. Our goal is being as efficient as possible in a fight, which means to use as little energy, strength, risk, explosiveness as possible. Use as little as possible to achieve our goal. As little as possible, but no less, right? And that's a never-ending measurement that hopefully, as we continue learning the art, gets more and more refined. To when somebody can become a black belt, they'll be doing the same movements they did as a blue belt, but just so much more efficiently, right? That's kind of our idea. There's also more efficient ways to mechanically do things. And we're always refining that too. When we find a more efficient way to do a fundamental, then we will do it. And for example, rear naked choke, there are the rough fundamental mechanics you can look at, and to the naked eye, especially somebody that didn't have a strong background in jiu-jitsu, they would not be able to tell the difference. The hands appear to be in roughly the same space and everything. But you and I both know there are more efficient ways to perform that rear naked choke if you know how to apply it the right way, in particular get connection and all the kinds of things that Rickson and people like Henry Akins teach. That level of efficiency doesn't change when you put the gi on, doesn't change when you take the gi off. It doesn't change when I teach it to my tiny wife, doesn't change when I do it as a 275-pound man, doesn't change when a child does it, doesn't change in MMA, and it's not going to change in the street. That's the efficient way to do that rear naked choke. And that's a fundamental movement. It's a fundamental human movement. And we're going to teach that to everybody that comes through our door, because I think it's something they need to learn. But then over time, and it takes a long time, but over years, everyone will find their own best way to get into it, how they get into it, right? Their own little way of getting into it. And then the temptation is, when you become a teacher, is to teach your way of getting into it, which I think is a mistake. I think what you want to go back to do is just teach the core fundamentals and then create a game where your students can find their own way to get into it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because I think, like, we know that the setups are important or the entries are important. They're like we know that's everything, and you're not going to be able to get it if you can't get there. So let me show you 20 different ways to get there. But again, that's getting there is that element of I guess personality and body type, and
Right. So if instead you have a game where one side's starting on the back, for example, and the other side's maybe trying to do an escape or some particular movement, and the person on the back is allowed to go for the rear naked choke, and you set the timer and you do 5 minutes each side, then switch, and you do that for 45 minutes. Everybody in that room will figure out their own little ways to hand fight, their own ways to get that choke, and you might show some things here. I'm not saying we're restricted and like we never show good entries as we like to do, but by really keeping the curriculum close to the fundamentals, I think what you do is you accelerate the students' learning curve, because they're really only focusing on the things that really, really do matter, and at least in class. And then you're creating an environment where each athlete has maximum room for freedom to develop their own way of doing it. When I go to schools that aren't SBG sometimes, and I watch their classes, I will know that the teacher teaches his own style or her own style, because I'll watch all the students and they're all trying to do the same kind of guard, the same kind of sweep. They're doing the same kind of pass. And it's just such a really inefficient way to do jiu-jitsu, because I've never seen two black belts that should roll the same way or do. Right? Everybody has their own style. And if I just taught what I do well at my gym, I don't even know if I'd have any black belts. I have my own way of doing it. But mechanically, what underlies my movement, the under the surface, the structure, the skeleton of what's going on, that's the same for me as it is any of my other black belts.
Yeah, I really understand that, because for me, I feel confident showing something that, hey, this works in my game. Get after it. Like, that gives me the confidence to actually teach it.
Right.
Just basically teach it with confidence. So I've been, figuring out the ways that, that we can get figuring out the ways that we can add, allow people's personality to grow. And the way I've been thinking is, when they're doing those techniques, instead of saying, hey, this is the setup, this is the way, is just paying attention, watching, and then offering something from experience that a coach can say, hey, try this, see how it goes. You're close to it already. Maybe give that a go and see.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think the main thing is, create games. And this is actually really easy to do with jiu-jitsu. It's a little bit harder to do with stand-up. But with jiu-jitsu, it's so easy because we can just make positional games, right? So if we're talking about a choke, for example, we can have people starting in the position where that choke occurs. So I may have shown that choke in class. And then when it gets time to drill, I'll have them start with the choke almost all the way on. So most of them are going to have close to 100% success, maybe 90% success, and then have the person resist. And then we'll do it. And then, like Rickson said, we'll back up and back up and back up. Now, eventually, we're back to a position where you're just on the back, but your hands aren't engaged around the neck yet at all. And now they have to start to get in and get the choke. And before that, we will have taught them the fundamentals of hand fighting and how you efficiently get the choke on. But then we're going to let them play. And the majority of the class, it's an hour class, for example, 40 minutes of that class is going to be drilling. And it's going to be drilling in the position or the place where the lesson occurred today in class. So we have 10 minutes of introduction stage where we're showing the whatever the fundamental technique is, fundamental human movement. We make sure everybody can do it without resistance, which honestly doesn't take long for most people, 5 to 10 minutes maybe. And when you see they have it, now you set up a drill. And one of my requirements for SBG coaches is they should be able to create a drill for anything instantly like that. They can look at any problem, any skill set, whether we're talking about stand-up clincher ground, even firearms, whatever it is, and they can immediately come up with a live drill that the class can then do. And the focus on the class is that drill. And through that process, they're getting timing. And then at the end, sometimes we have 5 or 10 minutes at the end of class, we'll let them start in that position, just wrestle to submission. If it's jiu-jitsu, and that's the context, so we've isolated a piece of the game. We've introduced a piece of the game. We've isolated it with timing, and then we integrate it back into the whole, whatever it is, jiu-jitsu or MMA, and let them play with it. And that's kind of our process for doing it. And to be honest, it's really simple with jiu-jitsu, because jiu-jitsu lends itself so well to positional sparring.
Yep.
Right. You could think of any technique you can think of in jiu-jitsu. You can make a simple drill really by just having people start without that technique occurs, and giving them a particular place and then going back to it over and over again. So they get timing at that little spot.
Yeah. And just show them the finish and let them play to work their way there.
Sure. Right.
And I guess when you say drilling too, it's fun drilling, right? It's fun drilling. It's not, drilling. It's yes, drilling. We're having fun.
I mean, if you like rolling, you're going to love drilling the way we drill.
Mm-hmm.
I can hear sometimes. So, for example, before the virus hit, I was spending some time really focused on the UPA with my students, and because I found that a lot of people were doing it wrong, or what happens is often they get away from it, partially because the elbow knee escape works so well, especially some of my black belts. So we would do rounds during my competition team practice where I'll say one side holds mount, one side escapes. 5 minutes, and then I let them switch. I like longer rounds because it gives your body time to problem solve. And they'll go back to what they do best. So if they're good at the elbow knee escape, they'll keep doing the elbow knee escape over and over again. And so then as a coach, I now have to change the game. So I say, okay, 5 minutes, one side hold mount and attack, and one side escape, but you're only allowed an UPA. And you can hear some of the students in the class go, but to me, that's fun, and they're still having fun. Now it's a challenge. Now they're only allowed to do that one escape. They're going to have to get sneaky and figure out ways. They've got a black belt on top of them. Figure out ways that he or she doesn't quite see it coming, so they can still make it work. But what that does by isolating that piece is it gets them really good. But then we can go back. And put it back into the hole, and their game is much better than it was before. Because with jiu-jitsu, what happens is, I'm sure you've discovered, if all you do is roll, if you just teach a bunch of techniques and let the students roll, especially if it's an environment where it's very competitive, everybody's going to do what they're good at. And you'll get good at the routes, but people will have holes. They'll have parts of their game that they don't like to go to, so they avoid them. And I think one of our jobs as coaches, as jiu-jitsu coaches, is to make people go to those places so that they develop skill, fundamental skill in all the different positions, because we don't want the first time they have to struggle out of that spot to be against somebody who's very good at that spot in the tournament or in a other situation.
Yeah, and it's making them go to those places that they're uncomfortable and don't like, but in a fun environment where there's no pressure on failing. Is that
exactly where I am constantly saying every single time I'm teaching class or about to do a drill? Failure is an essential part of the process. It's not just okay, it's mandatory. Like if you're not failing through the whole thing, you're still back at the introduction stage. You're probably not really acquiring any time.
Yeah, and that was a huge thing for me recently. I had a chat with my friend Andy from School of Grappling, and he pointed out that a lot of what coaches will often do is try and take their failures and say, hey, students, you don't have to fail. I did the failing for you. Here's what you just do instead. And he said that's catastrophic. You have to let people fail for themselves and learn, and you're just there to guide it.
That's very insightful. 100% true. We can try and save them time. Obviously, that's part of what our job is as a coach, but you can't short circuit that process for them. Like you can't give people timing.
Yeah.
So I can show them exactly what they need to do, but you have to let them put in the work to be able to do it. And that work requires failure. You can't fail for them. My failures don't give you timing. They give me timing. They don't give anybody else timing.
Exactly right. So, yeah, that's there's a lot to take in from that conversation from me, Matt. It's been really excellent. I guess in summarizing, if I've got an idea now of your martial arts philosophy, maybe, or just your ideas about it, is it like we're searching for. We're doing a physical activity that we're searching for the truth in a universal human experience of wrestling and fighting, and we're looking to teach or help other people find that truth and have fun while doing it. Is that? That's
great. Yeah, that sums it up pretty much. What we try and do at SBG.
I like it. That's beautiful. Matt, thank you so much. I'd love to have you on again and talk about some other of your thoughts, stoicism and critical thinking. Awesome. If people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to go about doing it?
Yeah, for gym related stuff, they can go to straight-gym.com. And a couple of years ago, I started SBGU, which is my shirts. That's our online university. I think we have close to 1,000 different videos on there now. And I put up, when I'm teaching, my classes go up there every week. And now that I haven't been teaching the virus, I've been putting up classes of training with my wife. But there are multiple clips that go up every week. So if people are interested in our stuff, they can go on there. And for more essays and writing and things like that, not necessarily always related to martial arts, they can check out mattthornton.org. But straight-gym.com usually has the links for all that.
Awesome. And I'll be getting in touch with Ben Powell from SBG Sydney as well. And
yeah, he's great, very talented. Definitely probably worth having on the podcast or training with once all this is over.
Yep. No, definitely. Matt, thanks so much, and hope you have a good day, and we can do this again in the future.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thanks, mate.
You have been listening to the Sonny Brown Breakdown. Until next time, you can visit sonnybrown.net to find out more ways to break it down.